All right. Thank you, and hello, everyone. One of Excel's most popular features is what we call a pivot table. I imagine some of you have been using this feature. Maybe some of you have not. I want to suggest at the beginning, it's not a terribly difficult topic, but if you're strictly trying to learn it off the printed page, sometimes it's not so clear. We move data around a lot. Sometimes that doesn't come across on the printed page. What we're going to be doing is creating a number of different pivot tables based on data that I've got on different worksheets here. I am using Excel 2016. Some of you might be using Excel 2013, 2010. 2013 and 2016 are nearly identical in how we use pivot tables. There is one difference I'll point out when we come to it. The basic concept of pivot tables, of course, has not changed over the years. So the worksheet that we're seeing on our screen, in one sense, is typical in that it's a list that has a titled row on top and then row after row of data. If I were working with this list, I probably would have it sorted, either by product or salesperson, that sort of thing. I don't at the moment, and that's not a prerequisite for using this feature called a pivot table. If you have never seen a pivot table, the whole idea of how to define it is a little tricky. One approach is to, first of all, give it some scope. A pivot table is a new creation in a certain sense, like a chart is. How do we create a chart? We've got some source data, and we turn it into a chart. Same idea with a pivot table. You can't just, like with a chart, you can't just take any data and turn it into a chart. Same thing with a pivot table. The source data for a pivot table has to be what we would loosely call a list. This list has row after row of data. It can go on and on and on. This is actually about 900 rows. If you work with this data frequently, if you sort it, if you filter it, you probably have learned in using Excel that it always tends to work best if your titles are in a single row on top and then row after row. I've got another title above that. It's separated by a row. Think of that as being something separate. Nothing wrong with it up there. Often I don't have that kind of situation, but that's fine. Before using your source data to turn it into a pivot table, if you're not too familiar with it or maybe you haven't seen it in a while, it's not a bad idea just to do a couple things. Click in the data, double-click the bottom edge of the active cell. Click, double-click. This will take you down to the bottom. Unless there's an empty cell in there, it might stop at that point. Another approach, I'm going to, first of all, zip back up top. I'll double-click the top edge. If you click within your data and Control-A, think of A for all. Now if you press Control period multiple times, the active cell moves around the corner. And I stress, you don't need to do this all the time with your data, just occasionally, just to make sure that it's all together. If you've got your titles in two rows, redesign them. Get them into a single row. It's always going to be better. And make sure these entries are unique. In other words, no two of them should be alike. So, in looking at this for a little bit, I can tell you ahead of time there are 12 salespersons, and imagine they work for some major retailer. They would work for the wholesaler, and they sell to the retailers. Those are the customers in column D. And any salesperson can sell any of the products to any of the regions. Nobody's got exclusive control over one region or anything like that. So you've got a list like this, and like I said, you'd probably sort it. The other data management tools, in addition to sort, we find on the Data tab up on the ribbon. There's sort, filters, widely used, of course. To a lesser extent, you might be using subtotal. And what does subtotal do? It gives us some new information. And in a certain sense, that's kind of where we're headed here. A pivot table is a tool that will allow us to quickly create good summary information. We can also, in terms of manipulating the data, create some analysis of that data. Now, off to the right here, I've done something manually. Column H pretty wide here, and make it narrower. A moment. Here's the kind of list we might be thinking of, for example. It's one of many different kinds. You see the salesperson's name over in column A, we've got region in column C, we've got items in column F. We'd like to come up with some totals like this. And not just this, but imagine if you were making a presentation of this data. First of all, how would we get here? Without a pivot table, we'd have to be writing formulas. I'm going to double-click on cell J4 right here. Now, that's not the most difficult of Excel functions. It's called SUMIFs. Some of you might have used it. But a good experienced Excel user in coming up with a list like this, give him or her 10, 15 minutes or so to verify the results and all that. We can create a pivot table like this without formulas. It'll look just like this, same totals and everything, in about 5 or 10 seconds. And furthermore, if you were making a presentation of this in a meeting, if you were using formulas and somebody in your audience says, okay, that's all well and good, we've discussed this, instead of these 4 regions here, could you show the 5 products or the 5 customers? And your answer would have to be, if we didn't have a pivot table, well, give me 10 minutes or so, I got to rework this and verify the results. We obviously couldn't do that very efficiently in a presentation. So we will be able to do this with a pivot table. Typically, pivot tables are on a separate sheet from the source data, but they don't have to be. So we're about to create a pivot table. And after reminding you that many of our data management tools are found on the Data tab in the ribbon, pivot table is a little different. And perhaps if we think of it similar to a chart, then we know where to find it. It's going to be on the Insert tab in the ribbon. There is a feature introduced in Excel 2013 called Recommended Pivot Tables. I'll come back to that a bit later, because we will be creating more than one pivot table. So if you've scoped out your data, make sure that if there's any other data on the worksheet, make sure it's separated by at least one empty column. Click within your data. You don't have to highlight it each time. Let's go to this button, Pivot Table. Now, after you started creating pivot tables for a while, you'll usually give this dialog box a quick look, and that's it. The default location, we're about to see it here. Choose where you want the pivot table report to be placed, new worksheet. And I would recommend that. Over time, as you get more comfortable with it, sure, you can put it on an existing worksheet. But let's treat it as a separate entity we're about to create. Excel figures out the extent of your data. Looks good. We click OK. We're about to be on a new worksheet. Off to the left is what we would call a pivot table placeholder. Now, off to the right, we should see field headers, and for the moment, there it is. That had been turned off, looks like. We'll see this. This might be floating. Hold on. If you want to dock it, you can double-click the title bar. It'll be off to the side. For the moment, you wouldn't necessarily know what to do. I'm going to make it a little bit wider, and we'll come back to this. It is important, and when you work with pivot tables, this pivot table fields list, you'll want to be able to move back and forth. Do this. Now, it said 5 seconds. I'm talking, so obviously it's taking a bit longer than that. We click that button. We're on a new sheet. A couple of clicks and a drag, and we will be there. I'll click the box for salesperson. Watch the left side of the screen. That's a unique and alphabetized list of our salespersons. I'll click the box for items, tracking items sold, sum of items. I didn't point out the totals. You might have seen it. It was 8111. We saw that earlier. And the third step I'm taking, I'm dragging the region field into this area down here called columns. There's our pivot table. You might have noticed off to the right, when I did check the box there for salesperson, we also see it down here in an area called rows. Salespersons are in rows over on that pivot table. And region is in separate columns here. So, although it's not obvious at first, the lower portion of this pivot table fields list, and at times you will make it taller, perhaps you can do this. This is like a mapping, excuse me, a mapping of the pivot table. Meanwhile, here's our pivot table with not a formula in sight. Who's our top performer here? Willie Loman, 1073, total 8111. I'm going to go back to the pivot table itself. We can get to it at the bottom of the screen here. Sheet name, I didn't point it out, was appliance sales. We could jump back and forth. We're seeing exactly the same totals here off to the right as we're seeing in the pivot table. But here, in this original data, remember those long formulas and functions, we don't worry about that at all in the pivot table. In fact, we didn't even see them. Click on the cell, we don't see any formulas. We got here pretty quickly. Something else you might notice here too, when the active cell is within a pivot table, not only do we see that pivot table fields dialog box to the right, but we've got, in effect, a new ribbon, Pivot Table Tools. There's an Analyze tab here and a Design tab with features related to pivot tables. If I click over in column H, and I will momentarily here, click, watch those tabs disappear, as well as the PivotTable field list. And that's, of course, because the active cell is not within the PivotTable. Click on the PivotTable somewhere, and they return. Now, what I strongly recommend, and again, it's perhaps a matter of personal choice, but these terms, row labels and column labels, are certainly not wrong. But on the other hand, it's not very helpful to someone else if you were making a presentation or if you print this data. For a while, you might leave them there if you're not showing this to others. Let this idea sink in. These are row labels. They're in the rows area. And in the PivotTable fields list off to the right, we see salesperson under rows. Column labels relate to the regions here. These is the columns area, or actually this part right here. And in the PivotTable fields list off to the right, we see region in the columns area. The values themselves right here are in what we call the values area. So again, as we look back and forth, we are reminded of that. But the terms row labels and column labels, I nearly always change them, and almost as soon as I create a pivot table. It's on the Design tab in the ribbon. You wouldn't necessarily know where to go at first. It's under Report Layout. Right now, it has no meaning at the moment, Show in Compact Form. That's what we call the default. If you choose Outline or Tabular, and I'm about to choose Tabular, you will see the actual field names here, salesperson and region. I think that's what most of us would want. And, of course, standard Excel features are in play. If I wanted to adjust the column widths, click in the upper left corner, double-click any column boundary that's a little bit tighter. We could certainly right-align these if we wanted to.
Thank you so much for taking a few minutes to watch this clip from one of our online meetings. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, stay up to date, and stay compliant. This video is brought to you by GRCTS. We are also known as GRC Training Solutions. And here's a quick information about us and what we do. We conduct many compliance and non-compliance training courses throughout the year, covering some of the most important areas within several industries. Our focus is to provide the best and the most up-to-date classes to our audience. All training modules are designed and facilitated by industry subject matter experts who possess years and years of experience and understand compliance very well. Our customers attend our online classes from all over the world. If you're not available to attend live meeting classes, you can always opt in to get unlimited access to our on-demand or recorded classes. We also provide in-person and face-to-face workshops, on-site workshops where our experts will visit your company at your location and train you and your colleagues, LMS trainings, and finally corporate subscription plans, where you pay a little amount to enjoy unlimited access to our courses. We have monthly, quarterly, and annual subscription plans. Here's our contact information for you. If you're interested in learning in any of these topics, or if you know a colleague or a friend who might benefit from our classes, please contact us or visit our website for more information. It's www.grcts.com. You can always send us an email, support@grcts.com, or just give us a call, 248-233-2049.